And of course, we're going to be having another topic later on in which our moderator will not only come back on stage, but will also be the speaker. But just to give Dr. Nirmal a little bit of time to breathe, a little bit of time to rest, I also want to let everyone know, hopefully this was a very thought-provoking, insightful discussion for each and everyone. As what Dr. Nirmal said, doing less is actually no good. Because if you think about it, it borders around apathy. And what we want is compassionate individuals who want to create concrete, beneficial initiatives that can create positive social and positive environmental impact. And of course, this is also one of the goals and the aims, planting that seed within today. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know, if you can look under your program, we also have envelopes over there. So inside these envelopes are our commitment forms. We like to call it our pledge forms. And these are things that if you are interested in, you can fill up. And at the end of the day, our ushers and usherettes are just going to be getting it at the table. So please do, when you have the time, fill up our interest forms, our pledge forms, if you were moved in any way in any of the discussions. So that was just, by the way, our first topic. So let's move on to our second topic. Let's get to know our moderator a little bit better. Reintroducing our moderator as our speaker now for today. I'd like to give impact and give highlight to all of his achievements for over 2 decades. He has been at the front line of sustainable design in Asia, where he is an active educator, an active researcher, an active consultant, author, and a thought leader. Currently an associate professor of the School of Design and Environment at the National University of Singapore, NUS, where he leads the graduate program of Master of Science in Integrated Sustainable Design. He teaches and researches into how emerging principles of socio-ecological thinking translates new pathways for practitioners all over Asia. He has sat on several advisory panels in China, in Singapore, in Vietnam, shaping policy and formulating guidelines that affect design practice. 2 of his past books have been in particular relevance. The first being Greening Asia, Emerging Principles for Sustainable Architecture, that was written in 2012. It critiqued the green movement in Asia. It postulated new principles for design thinking. The second book of which is the more recent one. It's Eco-Puncture, Transforming Architecture and Urbanism in Asia, that was written in 2019. Now this endeavored to move the discourse towards regenerative thinking. He's currently the editor-in-chief at EcoGradia, where he hosts a groundbreaking podcast. Currently in its 5th season, the podcast aims to bring to audiences voices of thoughts, thinkers, and makers who are shaping a regenerative future. To talk on the topic and the world beyond sustainability and net zero, the critical role of regenerative design and development in catalyzing positive systems change, let's welcome back on stage Dr. Nirmal Krishnani.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Right. I think I have a similar journey as Marianne, which is it started with a deep-seated dissatisfaction with what my profession was doing. And so I find that when you are dissatisfied, you always go upstream, as we did with the rivers. You kind of go up to the source of the problem. So I quit consultancy, I became a teacher, and I have a feeling that I will end up in meditation when I retire. Because that is the logical conclusion to our journey. But I bring that up because I think a big part of what I'm exploring through research and teaching is, what does regenerative design mean in Asia? It's a word that gets used a lot, and it has its origins. In North America, the conversation began there. But what does it look like on the ground here? And this has been a key question of how do we move forward? Because if it's just something we read in a textbook or something that we hypothesize, then it becomes abstract. It doesn't allow us to act. So let me see if I can figure out how this works. There we go. Please forgive the graph, force of habit, academia. But I want to just elaborate a little bit of what Marianne said about regenerative design. Where does it sit? If we think about the world we inhabit and the negative impact that we have, then we have been told that building green is a way of doing less harm. And therefore we move from conventional design thinking to green design thinking, and we achieve less negative impact. Somebody jokingly said that green is just a slower way to die. You're still going to die because you're still doing harm, but it just slows things down. It doesn't change the fundamentals. And so we see a lot in the last 20 years of this kind of sustainability, which is buildings that have green certification, glass boxes, fully air conditioned, but very efficient because they meet the expectations of a checklist. Yeah. So this is the do less harm approach. Then, as Yanni suggested, we are now moving towards a center point, a kind of a position of static. Like we do no harm, but we don't do much else. And this is your net zero world. And there are lots of these projects. We've built one in my campus in Singapore. It's a net zero energy building. It produces as much energy as it consumes. There are examples of net zero water, zero carbon, etc. But we're all striving for zero, like as if that is the goal, and as if we can sustain zero. So this is another illusion that we buy into. The question then we ask ourselves is, what lies beyond the negative? How do we enter the world of the positive? And here is where I think the Regenesis project is so instrumental in showing us the way forward. I'd like to show you a few projects that I have found in Asia, starting with this one. This is a project in Singapore called Kampung Admiralty. It is a mixed-use development in a public housing estate, and it combines housing for the elderly, retail, public space, etc. It's unusual because it does all that. Yeah, we have been, we know how to design this or that. We think of land use as housing or commercial. We think of it as park or building. But here is a building that shows us how to do this and that. So here is this is a project by Woha, a Singapore-based firm. Here is how the form of the building, the architecture, creates the possibilities of both social and ecological space. There is room for people on the ground, for us to interact, for communities to form, and there is room for biodiversity on the roof. So this is a really interesting example of how in dense urban conditions you can do this and that. The socio-ecological paradigm produces benefits across different stakeholders. So if we talk about nature, this project has the highest species count, more than green areas in that neighborhood. It is also a very people-centric space, yeah? And it attracts all kinds of social activities, thousands of visitors, not just from the neighborhood, but from across the city. So we're seeing this idea of the social and the ecological intersecting through good design, through strategic thinking. What then is the transition to regenerative design and development? Yeah. What more does this demand of us? I asked this question at the end of the panel discussion because I think it goes to the core of any enterprise that seeks to do good, which is who profits? Who profits from any action? And so we know from things that Marianne has said or things that we're observing in projects like Kampung Admiralty, there is the question of nature, there is the question of people and community. But what about the developer, the people that put money into this project? What do they get out of it? And I want to present to you a series of projects. I'll run through them quickly so you get a feel of this idea of regeneration across the Asian condition. Yeah? And I want to show you how they achieve a win-win-win situation, which is to say it's good for people, it's good for nature, it's good for business. And that is the key, win-win-win. The first is a project in Taiwan, in the city of Kaohsiung. This is a stadium, the National Stadium of Taiwan, Kaohsiung. Kaohsiung is a city that went through a regenerative process at the economic level. They started to phase out dirty industries, and they started to introduce green industries as part of the economic transition. And so part of that was building new infrastructure that would reflect this shift towards a new outlook. The stadium is located in a brownfield site in the middle of the city, but it is, in spite of its condition, it is surrounded by nature and community. So what happened in this project was this intentional synthesis between what people and nature want. The architecture of the building is very unique. This is the architect Toyo Ito from Japan. Building is snake-like. It sort of sits in the landscape. What you see right away, all my students see anyway, what they get drawn to is the roof, because it is the world's largest single building installation of solar panels. This building produces a ton of electrical power. So a building that for most of the month is unoccupied is actually churning out electrical power. But the exciting thing about projects like this is that they are not confined to the question of power and resources. They also generate space, public space. They create space for biodiversity. They create space for hydrology. And so here is a systems drawing showing you how in the configuration of the project, these three systems are distributed. When the land around the stadium is publicly accessible as a park, it has event spaces, promenades, it has water filtration systems, water detention systems, it has greenery that attracts biodiversity. The flooding in this area has diminished as a result of this project. Yeah. So if we begin to break it down, there are many new and transplanted trees, many new species of shrubs and plants that have been included, and there is an increase in carbon sequestration. So nature comes out a winner. People, over 300,000 people that live within 3 kilometers have access to a park that did not exist before on a brownfield site. Yeah? And it packs in amenities and recreational spaces. The developer, and in this case it's the city, yeah? The developer is an institutional developer, had in the bargain a solar power plant, 1,140 megawatt hours annually, meeting 70% of on-site energy demand. And when the complex is not in use, it pumps enough energy into the grid to satisfy 80% of local demand. Win, 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 right? This is regenerative development. Here's another project. The Jetwing-Ville Wiana. It's a resort in Sri Lanka. I love this project because the story is so inspiring. It's situated in a peri-urban area not far from Sigiriya, which is an archaeological site in Sri Lanka. The story of this is that it was conceived during the civil war. Sri Lanka had this protracted civil war when businesses were suffering, and the company Jetwing Hotels, the younger of it's a family business, so the son of the CEO decided to invest in ecological restoration. There was no tourism industry, but he said, one day the tourists will be back and they will want this. Yeah. This is to the point that was made earlier about that if you paint a vision of the future that is optimistic, they will come. They will come. Yeah. And so they spent $1 million. It doesn't sound like a lot, but in Sri Lanka, that's a lot of money. They spent $1 million before a single building went up. They restored the ecology, the hydrology of the site. They restored the waterways, they reconnected fragments, they created water detention systems, yeah, and they connected it back to a mechanical system that would support the new resort. And they did come back. Nature came back, yeah, onto this desolate site that had been abandoned from farming, this brownfield site. And that little creature that you see on the right, that's the loris. It's an endangered species. which is one of the main attractions of the resort now. People actually go to the resort, pay an astronomical sum of money, by the way, to see the lorries, you know. They also initiated a lot of community activism, education, tours, training of people in the neighborhood, in the villages, etc. So nature, now it's a home to a vast number of species, 140 birds, 25 mammals, etc., including the lories. 60% of the staff are from nearby villages, so it's all about employment. The resort also is an epicenter of education and awareness building. It is the flagship building of this company now. It is one of the best known eco-resorts in the world. If you Google eco-resorts, it will show up in the top 10 list. Yeah. Unfortunately, Sri Lanka is going through another difficult period. Yeah. But this project became the most successful project in the company's portfolio because of all that investment in nature and people. Here's another project, the Organo Nandi. This one's in India. It's a residential development on the outskirts of the city of Hyderabad. Hyderabad is in the middle of India. If you point your finger right in the middle of India, you will probably hit Hyderabad with your finger. Yeah. Like a lot of cities in Asia, Hyderabad is congested, it is polluted. It has become difficult to live in Hyderabad. And so this developer had the idea that they would sell a healthier lifestyle on the outskirts of the city. So basically, you would buy a second home on the outskirts of Hyderabad, where you would take your aging parents or your children on the weekend to recover from the city. You could commute. So the villas are packaged as places where you grow your own food, they collect their own energy and water. It's a self-sufficient community. Majority of Indians are vegetarian, so it was not difficult to be self-sufficient in food because you didn't have to, you didn't have to worry about meat. So all the vegetables, including milk and paneer and all that kind of stuff, is produced on site. This is very important. I tell you, the most undervalued aspect of sustainability is health. You tell someone they're going to save money because of energy, they will be not interested. You tell a rich person that if you do this, you will live longer, they all pay attention. That's I'm speaking to the developers in the audience, yeah. You have to sell this to the right, you have to speak the language of the audience. So the way this was done is that a big part of the land was actually set aside for ecosystems and for agriculture. The villas form the perimeter. The center, the big plots in the center are for food production and for water and ecosystems restoration. This just shows you a quick section of how the farms facilitate groundwater recharge. There's water detention systems. That pond has become a biodiversity hotspot, etc. Yeah. And of course, you're not isolated. You can never draw a line around your site and say, I am sustainable or I'm regenerative within this space. You have to bring the community along with you. So they started, for their own self-interest, this was not some ethical dilemma. They said, in order for us to be healthy, we have to change the way farming is done in the neighborhood. So they started to train the farmers in organic methods of farming. Yeah. People. This estate is now an advocate for better farming through seminars and events. As of 2018, 93 farmers in the district had switched to organic farming methods, which actually earns more money on the market. If you sell organic food, it's a higher price point than if you sell regular food, right? By 2017, the nearest aquifer had been restored. Water table rose by 36 meters. The pond is now a biodiversity hotspot. The project was a massive commercial success. It was sold out. They went on to phase 2. We met with the developer, the same developer, earlier this year. They are replicating this formula across India. There are Organo Nandi type projects coming out across India, where what they sell is not just a box to live in, but a better lifestyle, a healthier lifestyle, a lifestyle where you are connected to nature. Yeah. Shifting scales, this is a park in China, the Yangweizhou Park, in a city, Jinhua. It sits at the confluence of rivers. It's a government-initiated project, initiated by the mayor of the city. And it was a brownfield site. It used to be for mining, so it was a very unpleasant, toxic land. And the images that you see on the right are the restoration. Of course, it is a hugely popular piece of land. It draws people from both sides of the river. This is what it looks like from the air. So that bridge across the two halves of the city acts as a kind of a public space. People hang out on the bridge. They can use the bridge to go down into the park, to the water bodies, etc. Yeah. But this project by Yu Kongjian, he was the pioneer. He's the guy who invented the phrase sponge city. And this is the idea that parks or pockets of development in the city can become water detention systems. They can absorb water like a sponge and thereby minimize flood in other parts of the city, reduce the flooding risk in other parts. I mean, we were talking about this all through our visit to Cebu. Like, where can the sponges be in Cebu City? This is a big dilemma. Like, where do you put the sponges? Because it's so congested. But you know, here is an example of a park that behaves as a sponge. This is what it looks like when the rain comes. The bridge continues to function as a public space because the bridge is at an elevation higher than the worst expected flood. But okay, you can't go and do this when it's flooded. But when the flood recedes, you go back to that. The water drains out and the park is returned to the people. Nature. The total surface area of the park is now 100% permeable. To the point about sponge, it absorbs water. It's covered with more than 12 plant species. The landscaping has increased the sighting of fauna on site, which is animals and birds which are drawn to new habitats and clean water. The park has reconnected the two halves of the city, but it's reconnected the people of Jinhua City to nature, where the city had very little access to public space or to gardens. This derelict site is now a vibrant, multifunctional space, and has massive numbers of visitors. The peak flood in the city, in this area, has reduced by over 60%. And what is important for the mayor, for those of you in politics and planning, it has become iconic. It's become a blueprint in China. It is emulated throughout the country. Yeah. And it has lent credibility to the idea of sponge cities. It shows us what a sponge city looks like. That it is not just a hydrological invention. It is an object of utter joy. When you go there, you feel happy. Yeah. Happiness is underrated. When I first graduated, when I finished my PhD, and I thought, what does happiness have to do with sustainability? You can't construct happiness. You can't measure it. There are no metrics. I'm becoming more and more convinced that what we have to sell is joy and happiness. And then they will come, and the money will flow. Here's another project, Wusong Riverfront Pilot Project, also in China, situated in a very industrial part of China next to a very polluted river. These are all the pollution sites, the former industrial sites along the river, very contaminated. This was a commercial development, meaning it was meant to be profit-making. Now, how do you persuade people to live next to a polluted river? Well, you can if you make the property very, very cheap. Then it becomes low-cost housing next to a dirty river. But the developer had this brilliant idea that the way to attract people to raise the value of the real estate, you have to bring nature back. And so phase one of the project was that thing that you see at the top, which was a series of detention ponds where water is cleaned. Water is drawn in from the river, it gets progressively cleaned, and then extra water gets discharged. And surrounding that clean water, nature has come back. The birds have returned, the animals have returned, the fish are there. Once, Marianne said water. Water is the beginning of life. Yeah. So by cleaning the water, you bring life back into that neighborhood. And phase 2 is where they make the money. Yeah. And this is the commercial development that is built as a second step in the process. Yeah. But that same piece of real estate would have made far less money if they had just built it next to a polluted river. So bringing life back. Remember, if you're selling joy, happiness, and life, then people are prepared to pay for it. They are. So nature, air quality, ambient temperatures are now corrected. Survey of birds and insect species shows an increased presence of fauna. The park offers amenity, it offers recreational space, it offers education, it offers well-being through a biophilic experience. Since the completion of phase 1, property prices in the district have risen. I don't have the number for how much, but this has been recorded now, somewhere. This one I have numbers. This is a park, a similar park in Singapore. You would think that in Singapore, as green as we are, that it doesn't matter where you live. You're always 5 minutes away from a park. But this was a park with a difference. This is the Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park. It's next to the central catchment and brings water down to the sea. The image on the top shows you what it looked like before. So in Singapore, much like what we've seen in Cebu, hydrological infrastructure was concretized canals. The goal of infrastructure, hydrological infrastructure, was speed. Collect as much water as you can and bring it to sea as quickly as you can, because water is a problem, right? Water was seen to be the enemy, right? So that was how engineering solutions produce a network of canals, large stormwater canals, which fragmented the cityscape because you couldn't cross them. You needed a bridge. There was no edge condition. What Bishan Park did, which was so radical for Singapore, is that it began to break down this hard infrastructure. It naturalized waterways. So that concrete canal that you see on top became a meandering river at the bottom that you see in the bottom. Constructed, yes, it's not nature as it would be. It's a constructed ecosystem. But in cities, maybe we do need constructed ecosystems. We need to relearn how nature performs and copy those lessons in the way that we design. This is Bishan Park today. I go to Bishan Park even though I live more than 15 kilometers away. It has that gravitational pull. And mind you, I live next to a park. Yeah. There is something about this place that feels different. And I have a suspicion it's the fact that we are so close to ecology. Yeah. Just a quick one. Here is what the park looks like when it's dry, when there's no rain, and the image on the right shows you how it behaves when it's wet. So the transformational idea here was not to rush the water, not to improve the efficiency, but to slow it down, to behave like a sponge, as Yu Kong Chen would say, to draw the water and hold it in place. And then when the water goes, it goes back to being a park. So this multifunctionalism of land use, of water detention systems, of hydrological systems, of ecological systems, and public space. Why do you have to pick one or the other? Why can't it be both? And as a result of that, it is hugely popular with Singaporeans. And I take my students every year, I make them go so they can see for themselves and feel what it's like to be touching dragonflies, not just reading about them. But the thing I tell you that really, really tips the scale is these guys. This is the otter that came out of the forest. Remember I showed you the image at the beginning that this park is next to the central catchment. That's a big forested area in Singapore. When the water was clean and the habitats were extended, animals came out of the forest. They discovered that their habitats were enlarged. They could go elsewhere and have babies. They didn't have to stick in the forest. They could find food. They could create habitats. And the otters are so adorable. The otters, we now have otter sighting communities in Singapore. You can go on Facebook and you can check where the otters are in Singapore today. I've grown up in Singapore. Huh? My idea of being close to nature was going to a seafood restaurant and picking the fish for dinner. Now we have this in our backyard. Those images, by the way, on the right, those are actually taken on site in Bishan Park by Nature Society people. So nature, in a pre-development audit, there was some 109 birds and butterflies. The number was increased to 177 by 2018. Visitorship to Bishan Park increased 33% since the park reopened. 99% satisfaction rating among visitors, making this one of the 4 top parks in Singapore. If we charge admission, we would be rich. Yeah. Actually, they did a study on how much revenue the park created. Not by admission, but in other ways. And here is the thing that everybody wants to know. Property prices around the park went up by up to 4.5%. This used to be a park with a big canal. When we naturalized it, the value of real estate shot up. Compared with property deeper in, further away from the park. So people are willing to pay for proximity for nature. Bill Browning, the guy who is famous for biophilic design, did a study of hotel prices. I mean, we know this intuitively, that when you book a hotel and they say garden view, you pay more. When they say sea view, you pay even more, right? We are willing to pay for proximity to nature. And the reason we're willing to do that is because we are wired for it. Our brains are wired to seek nature. And this is the core belief of biophilic design. It is what underpins, I think, to a large degree, what the Regenerative project is about. It would never work if nature was a bonus. We crave nature. It is in our genetic code. And therefore, when we live in cities which have little nature, we suffer for it. We suffer for it. So who profits from regenerative design and development? Going back to the original question. I want to reframe the answer to something different, which is, what is wealth? What do we mean by profit? Very often we talk about profit as a financial gain. We say, oh, I do this, my return on investment is 5 years and I make 20% over this amount of time, And that is how we measure the value of a project. But what these projects are showing us is wealth is measured in different capitals. Nature is wealth. Natural capital is wealth. What nature does for us through ecosystem services, it cleans the air, it filters water. This is wealth. When I'm next to an animal, I feel better. I have less likelihood of being sick and going to hospital. This is wealth, right? So we have to start thinking about wealth in new ways. People, human and social capital is wealth. If you're a mayor, your job is to improve human and social capital, right? And these projects are actively seeking out enhanced human and social well-being. And finally, the idea that wealth is purely financial. It is. Wealth is also financial, but it is also political capital. When you look at projects like Yangweizhou Park in China, the political capital that came from that far transcended the city. Other cities were copying it. It became a movement in the country. So I think what you're doing with Regenerative project is also about creating political capital. Every mayor becomes a shining hero in their own movie, And I think of this as an exchange rate, like how many pesos to the US dollar. These are two currencies, but they're both different forms of wealth, right? So All these different capitals are forms of wealth that have an exchange rate. When you increase natural capital, you increase human capital. When you increase human capital, you increase financial capital. That is the trick. You have to see the relationship of wealth across the spectrum of ideas. Yeah. I just end off by saying that this was the culmination of all this, a book that I worked with, Alakesh Datta, who was my collaborator on this book. We researched all these different projects across Asia, and we wrote a book called Ecopuncture, which is an obvious pun on acupuncture, in case it wasn't apparent. Yeah. And now I'm, as Marianne mentioned, I'm busy with a podcast where I bring a lot of people together, different points of view on regenerative design, including people like Bill Reed and Krishna Duplessis on the bottom right, Bill Browning, who I've interviewed, Boha, etc. But I want to announce, in case you don't already know this, 3 days ago we released the latest episode of Ecogradia, and it features Marianne. I interviewed 3. Yes. It's an amazing episode, and for all of you students in the back, it should be compulsory listening. Because the question asked was, how do you assume a mantle of leadership in regenerative design? How do you go from here to there? You've just graduated. You're exhausted by your bosses and your spouses and your parents and the pressure. You know, how do you go from here to there? And these 3 individuals, Marianne and Giovanni and Christina, who have very, very different, shall we say, trajectories. Yeah, they all got to where they are in very different ways. But their stories I found so inspiring. You know, in terms of how do we go there? How do we get there? So, parting note, go to Ecogradia. Shameless pitch. And listen to the latest episode with Marianne Datta. All right, thank you guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nilmo. Wonderful, insightful presentation. If I could ask you to go up on stage for our panel discussion on your very interesting topic indeed. Regenerative design thinking. It's so interesting in the way that it's not only about being functionality driven, but it's also about inculcating and incorporating the existing natural resources, the ecosystem of the environment, and even the agriculture to really make and maximize and make it beneficial. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about that. Hopefully, we all have inspired any maybe burgeoning architects, anyone who is into urban planning, designers, developers. Hopefully you all were inspired to create a little bit of what was given as a proof of concept. And to further inspire you more, I will be giving you our panelists for the discussion for today. I'd like to call back on stage to moderate for our discussion today, our CEO and founder of the Regenesis Project, Architect Marianne. We're calling back on stage. Not only is she a featured moderator, not only is she a featured podcast star in the Ecogradia, but she's also going to be here with us today. We'd also like to call on stage our next panelist, a graduate of BS in Electronics and Communications Engineering in De La Salle University, a professional electronics engineer, and placed 13th in the licensure exam, completing his executive master's in business administration at the Asian Institute of Management with acquired units in the dissertation stage, also obtaining a degree in Doctor of Business Administration, working as a senior technical engineer at Pentac Cebu, Philippines Corporation, before setting his own company, Asia Technologies Corporation, in Mactan Economic Zone. Also currently the chairman of the board and president of the Cebu Institute of Technology University. He also serves as the current president of the Philippine Association of Colleges and Institutions. Please welcome Engineer Bernard Nicolas Villamor. To complete the roster of the panelists that we have here on stage, I'd also like to call on our PhD researcher in the National University of Singapore, a tutor in the MSc Integrated Sustainable Design Program, as well as an integral part of the team of the Regenerative project. His current research topics include looking at regenerative and systems-based approach to architecture with a focus on the topic of resource generation in cities. His research interest stems also from some groundbreaking projects that he was involved in, such as a project architect prior, including the SDE for Singapore's first net zero energy building, and also Apollo Fish Farm, the first vertical fish farm in the world. A certified architect in India, he has extensive industry experience in background, working in India, in the United States, and in Singapore for 11 years. We'd like to call on architect Alakesh Datta on stage as well to complete the roster. And now I will leave it to our moderator, architect Marianne.
All right, what a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much, Dr. Nirmal. Full disclosure, Professor Nirmal is my professor and Alakesh is my husband. We both graduated from the same master's program. And so we are kind of like his former students. So I've listened to many of your lectures, but it never gets old. I love listening to you and hearing like what you have to say. So you have been at the forefront of the sustainability conversation, right? You have been scouring the world and especially Asia for the best examples of sustainable projects. Here in the Philippines, sustainability equals green rating system. I'd like to hear from you if this is actually something that you look out for and if it's something that is still relevant.
I think green rating systems serve a purpose, and that is to produce the worst possible building that we will tolerate. So my point to my students is that platinum, and all green rating tools have platinum. Platinum is the minimum you should aim for. That should be your starting point. That is the worst building that you should be allowed to design. Anything below platinum, we shouldn't be having a conversation. Yeah. My problem with green rating systems is that they have stymied our desire to do more. We have grown comfortable with the idea that if we just tweak the building incrementally, if we do less harm, it'll all be okay somehow. Yeah. And this is an illusion that we have to wake up from. I just feel it's, in industry, it's a very difficult conversation to have because many industry stakeholders feel that if they just achieve certification, their job is done. So now we not only have to talk about the crisis of the planet and what else we need to do, but we also have to deprogram them. Yeah. We have to unlearn the things that we have been taught by green certification. And one of the biggest problems with green certification is that it tells us that the problem of sustainability happens at the scale of the building and the site. That is the line that you draw around the problem. And if you can just figure out how to do the stuff within that line better, it's going to be okay. I think this is not correct. I think the problem of sustainability, the bigger problem, is the problem of the city. Yes. It's not the problem of the building. There cannot be a sustainable building if there isn't a sustainable city. And there cannot be a sustainable city if there isn't a sustainable ecosystem surrounding and supporting the city. Yeah. So we have this concentricity of the problem, and by focusing on the building, we have missed the forest for the trees, quite literally. Yeah. It is distracting us from the scale of the problem that we need to tackle. Yeah. And so I know I come across very harsh, and I beg the forgiveness of anyone here from a Green Building Council in advance. But I do feel it is time for green certification to move on. I don't think it's a bad thing fundamentally. I think if you look at Singapore, for example, so many architects and engineers who previously didn't know or care about sustainability have been trained because of green certification to do more.
Yeah.
I just think it's not enough. The conversation needs to move on, you know, and we have to find a way of unshackling ourselves from this.
Yeah, and it all boils down to, again, unlearning, right? Imagine if we as architects or architectural students already have this fragmented and incomplete concept of sustainability. Imagine what would happen if you slap on this checklist. It will just break it down even more. And the whole conversation is lost. And there is then this laziness to do more, because as long as we just comply with this checklist and get some kind of rating, then we have already done enough. The problem, however, is that this is how the system works. This was how we were taught. This is, I think it's not just in the Philippines, but like all over the world, right? And that is why you are now like a co-program director for this Masters of Integrated Sustainable Design, where the key essence that drives design is systems thinking. Why do you think that this is not taught? Why do you think that this should not be the basis of design in the first place? Was it a hard one?
Well, I think it should. The simple answer is I think it should. But then there are, I mean, speaking as an architect, I think we teach architecture the way we did in the 20th century. The education of architects has not progressed from, you know, the ideals of the modern movement in Bauhaus, and we're still stuck in that mode of thinking. You know, the world, the planet around has moved on, and it's telling us that we need to rethink the way we approach design, but we don't, because there is so much inertia, there is so much resistance to the idea of, well, you know, if I surrender myself professionally to a system where, you know, I have to sit around the table with engineers and with landscape architects, and we are all equal, you know, and we all have something to say about the future of the planet, that for many professions can be very threatening. It can be very anxiety-provoking. I mean, Yu Kongjian, the Chinese landscape architect I spoke of, he often talked about how when he came back from Harvard and talked about, you know, landscape ecology of constructed ecosystems of deep form, he was vilified by his own profession. The first people to attack him were other, you know, civil engineers and landscape architects who felt that the message he was giving was in some ways challenging their authority and their right to make decisions, their livelihood, if you will, to bring it down to that. I think we need to break away from this shackle of disciplinary silos. And the problem, I should add, the problem is not just the education of architects. It is the education of engineers and landscape architects. We all are trained to behave in silos. Of course, when we graduate, we will act in silos. Why wouldn't we? Because that's how the training is done. So what we try to do with this master's program is we try to dissolve those boundaries, you know, at a postgraduate level.
Yeah. I think I would love to hear from Engineer Byrne, who is the president of Cebu Institute of Technology University and also of the colleges, the Association of Colleges, right? What is your aspiration in terms of like sustainable education for your whole university?
First of all, congratulations, Architect Yani. Can I just listen more to Professor Nirmal? I'm learning a lot from his talk. To be honest with you, we've been obsessed with just the word sustainable, sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, we just signed a partnership with De La Salle University, but it was only now at this afternoon that I heard that you're questioning the sustainability mindset. It's just doing less harm, but we want to do more. So my challenge now, the highest good for me, is for all universities wearing the hat now as the president of the Philippine Association of Colleges and Universities. It's about almost 200 universities all over the country, from Mindanao to Luzon, as old as 400 years old to as young as 5 years old. Also wearing the hat as the president of the Association of Private Colleges and Universities, or Region 7, which includes Bohol, Siquijor, Cebu, and Negros, well, before they became the Negros Island region, where the presidents are our chatmates. It really would matter a lot for them to have that mind shift of just having SDG as a mere compliance, to have a higher rating in the Times Higher Ed, to feeling good about your campus. The highest good for me now is the 16 students who've been blessed to deal with the professors, to hear this mindset questioning the development that we've had from using solutions from old thinking that's causing our problems now, and the systems thinking that there is really, it takes a while, or could take years, decades for us to feel the problem of our rivers, which means it could take another decade or 2 decades to fix that problem. We have to accelerate, and that is through our leaders. I would ask our school presidents to question how can they make their campuses a regenerative showcase for as young as the kindergarten students to college students. So I'm gonna commit our students, before we redesign our building, architect Manalo is one of the architects, question it if it is not just a green building, but beyond. And that is the highest good, that you are allowed to apply what you learn, to question authority. And if you do not question me, then you have failed as a student. You have to question, because I am a student of permaculture, a student of Raul Amores. And what I've learned in the past is a good foundation, but we have to unlearn and relearn. And this is something that I just learned today. And if we could, in Cebu, if we could just show a model, I'm willing for our school to be the model. The party will invite everyone to follow, and everyone else will follow, because it will be profitable on the selfish side. It will bring in more students who have their mental health is better with seeing, I don't know, maybe a river, a catchment, a sponge park. And I need your help. I need NUS, because we've been talking about a Singapore-like. We have to do it. And I think Cebu, Region 7, can lead the way for the country. And I think that's a legacy that NUS can leave. Architect Yani, that's my promise to you and your dad, your mom. And of course, making it happen after this seminar is what's more important. So we'd like to invite you after maybe 2 years, that what you talk about now will be not just in our university, but in other schools.
I'll be back.
For sure.
Just send me an invitation. We'll be back.
I love it. We have been spending a lot of time because of the NUS-CITU workshops, right? And that week, this week, gave me all the hope that we could ever need. Because in the span of 1 week, we were working with the local CIT students and the master's students, and they were working so harmoniously together, being equal in the conversation, And these are new things, new skill sets that they have to learn, mapping and all of those things. What gives me hope is that it's teachable, it's learnable, and they're able to learn it in a span of 2 weeks. So it's just a matter of providing the, a perfect enabling environment, and of course with the right leadership and the right support. Imagine if all schools do this, not just one school, but different departments in one school. Maybe architects and engineers should start to collaborate even while they're still students, definitely. So I'm so glad that we are starting this conversation. We had a discussion over dinner, and we're already kind of making informal commitments to each other that let's do it. Let's set up a Regenesis Academy for Regeneration and have it open. Let's put up a large scholarship fund so that there's more students who are really deserving, who are able to learn these kind of skill sets. So that is something definitely to look forward to and to come back for, by the way. And maybe the next time we go over to Bohol and
Can I just ask, because you've shared with us your journey, and it's quite remarkable. I mean, it almost feels like an awakening, a rebirth of sorts. I'm just wondering what the journey of students from my program looks like. And we've got Alakesh here. I just want to know what are the different pathways that people take to that awakening, and I wonder if you have anything.
So I was also part of the program that Dr. Nirmal was teaching, the Master of Science in Integrated Sustainable Design. And I had come from India to Singapore to do this because after working for 4 years in India, it was the beginning of the green rating movement. I soon realized that the green rating consultants, when kind of doing a superficial job, and as architects, if we went to them, the things they would say was just to comply with the checklist, and it wasn't really improving the design. And that's when I started looking for the course, and I ended up in the program in Singapore. I was amongst the lucky ones because after I graduated, I got to work on a zero energy building, Singapore's first zero energy building, which was in SD4, which was in NUS. And Professor Nirmal, who was my professor till a few months back, became my client. And we were sitting across the table, and now instead of it being an academic discussion, it was a real discussion with a real timeline, a real budget, and real performance outputs to be met.
I was the client from hell. Right?
But I also realized that doing a challenging project like that, the training I received in the program enabled me to, because it allowed us to, what the program taught us was to think beyond our silos. I think that Prof. Nirmal just alluded to earlier, where architects just do the design and give it to the engineers for the engineers to do their stuff. But the high performance building like the net zero energy building needed us to work more collaboratively. We had to understand what the engineer, of course we don't understand the technical requirements of the engineering, but at least we should appreciate how it influences the design and vice versa, the engineers also shouldn't go and put things everywhere because then the architect's vision of the building is affected. It was a challenge. I think the project, instead of initially being having a target of finishing the design phase in 6 or 8 months, required a 2-year design phase. But that was a steep learning for everyone in the project. And together with the school and the client side, finally today the building is a success. And it was, I think I learned a lot. What I learned in the program I was able to apply. And then I continued on that journey because I then got to work on a vertical fish farm project. Again, this is unique to Singapore, as Singapore imports 90% of its food. So the government has been looking at various ways of increasing self-production. So a client came to my boss to say, why don't you design a fish farm? When this project came in 2014, no architects designed a fish farm. And many of our colleagues were like, really, is this a project that we are designing a fish farm? But it was a vertical fish farm. It was a new thing. Our client was also willing to engage with us. So it became a new typology, something that now everyone is talking about, increasing food production in cities. So that has been my journey. But of course, in the industry, you plateau at sometimes. Not every project, the client would be willing to push the boundaries of being a net zero energy building or a fish farm or with food production as its target. So now I'm back in the academe. I'm doing my research with Dr. Nirmal, and I'm looking at how cities could increase their ability to produce resources, critical resources like food, energy, water, because cities are congested. Everything is competing for space. So within that scarce land and space, how then we create more opportunities to produce food, energy, water. So that's what I'm doing now.
Perhaps I could wrap up this panel with the last question to Dr. Nirmal. You gave very beautiful, very inspiring, case studies from around the world of what regenerative projects would look like. But this whole week, we were looking and going to site, and it was so absolutely depressing, At some points, I think some of the students were depressed. I was depressed. I don't know if you were depressed at some point. But what is, okay, so I guess the question is, do you think there is still hope? And what could we do about it?
That's unfair. It's unfair because that's the question I ask all my guests at the end of the podcast. So now the tables have turned. Of course there's hope. I mean, I think projects like this, even though they are in the minority, teach us that it's possible. You know, that is the power of these projects. They show us what is possible. I don't know what the students will produce by the end of November for Cebu. We'll see. But I think that I think the biggest thing that we will produce is a feeling of empowerment in these students. And I wish we could continue the journey with the CITU students and it wasn't just for 2 weeks. Because at the end of this process, and I see it in you and I see it in Alakesh, I see it in other people, at the end of the process, it's not that you have solutions, but that you feel empowered to act, you know. And that is the real gift of education, you know. And I think that there is hope because there is you guys. I mean, you know, we are going to retire. I know I don't look it, but I'm not far from retirement. But I'm just saying that the hope is you guys and things like the Regenerative project. That is the repository of hope.
Thank you so much. And by the way, thanks so much for having me on your podcast. I would never dream to even be on that podcast until another 20 years perhaps. So it's been such an incredible honor. And thanks so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
There we have it. Thank you very much. Big round of applause to our panel number 2, Beyond Sustainability and Net Zero. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Nirmal. Thank you, Architect Alakesh. Thank you very much, Architect Marianne. And also to Engineer Bernard. If there's one commonality that we have actually heard in our panel discussion, it's really that there is a need to empower communities, and we can even start as early as in the academe. We can start empowering people while they are young, while there's still passion and compassion. And there is so much that we can do to give and to share the knowledge to those who need it the most, who are hungry and who are thirsty to save the world in whatever way that they can.